Welcome back to the Disconnected podcast. I'm Jessica, and today I'm talking with Duncan Gasson-Gardner, who is a Zen practitioner and chaplain at the Vanderbilt Psychiatric Hospital. Welcome to the podcast, Duncan.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Could you tell us a little bit about your role as a Zen practitioner and chaplain?
Yeah, they're like two adjacent or like parallel roles as I think about them. Zen is kind of my personal practice. I belong to a local community here. And that is kind of what informs and gives me resilience to do my work as a chaplain. We'll probably talk more about this as we go, but I view chaplaincy not as like me necessarily giving things to people, but really looking at their strengths and trying to understand where are they coming from and how can I be supportive of their beliefs, their faiths, their practices when they're in crisis, right? So it's not really a time to receive a lot of new information. It's more about uncovering and reintegrating those things that are already helpful for them. And that's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah. Do you serve people of many different faiths?
Yeah, we have a range here. We're in the South. It's a largely Christian kind of clientele, but that's not always the case. We get people of all different faiths, and kind of increasingly people of no particular faith, or people that kind of like would identify in the spiritual but not religious category. And so there's like, what's important for all of it is like the individual kind of work, right? Because even if I go into the room of somebody who identifies as Baptist, and I think I know all about that, right? I think I've got some like assumptions about what they may believe or how it works or functions. Oh, no, you find out that like the individual person has a lot of their own kind of ways of navigating that and thinking about it. So even the big labels, especially the ones you think you know very well, like actually get you into trouble, because that's the place you begin to like lose sight of the individual, and because you're so focused on what it's supposed to be or what you think it's supposed to be.
It sounds very interesting to navigate and talk to lots of different people.
Yeah.
Could you give me a summary of your religious beliefs?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. Zen it's kind of like a sect of Buddhism, what's essentially like the meditation school. Buddhism develops in India, moves to China, and in China there's like development of the Chan school, the meditation school, which then also moves into like Korea and other countries. I follow a Japanese lineage, so it's made the jump to Japan, and then from Japan to the USA. So you're always kind of tracing backwards. So beliefs are not like they're not the focus in Zen. We try to interpret it more like as the practice itself. That becomes primary. In Zen, it's not necessarily about what beliefs you hold about the Buddha or about the kind of metaphysical claims of reincarnation or all these things you think about being part of this Buddhist belief package. But it's more about like your own practice and your own way of living your daily life in response to the realities around you. So just to say that it becomes very difficult for me to like, I don't know, parse it in a way. My own practice is based on the practice of like Zazen, seated meditation. And it's in the Soto tradition I'm a part of, we sit facing the wall, sitting cross-legged on the ground, facing the wall. And when we do Zazen, we're really kind of sitting with reality itself, with whatever kind of appears in our consciousness as we're doing it. And for me, like when I think about it, the idea is like, well, how do I just practice sitting with what is without trying to change it or shift it? And doing that is teaching me something about the contours of myself and my own experience. I sit with a sangha, with like a group of people. So the community is very important to me. Something that has been really brought to my attention this year when I haven't been like physically able to be with them very often. So there is for me like this community component too that's really important to my practice, because these are people that, I find to be really special people who are all very sincerely engaged in their life and their practice. And so like it's always like it's encouraging to me to be a part of that. So for me it's about, well, these days for me it's about having some compassion for myself and for the people around me. That's kind of where I am currently in my practice. I hope that answers the question. I know it's kind of like, it's just such a difficult one to answer.
Definitely. It really is. And I've had a couple interviews by now asking people about their beliefs. And it almost always seems to be that of it's very difficult. I have all of these ideas, I have all these things that I do that sort of come together as religion, but people do find that it's a very difficult question to answer. So you said it's more about practice and more about people. Do you
Mhm.
believe in any supernatural beings like a god or gods?
I'm going to try really hard to answer these questions from my own perspective rather than like, I also have kind of like a scholarly perspective on Buddhism, in which I'd make all these like carve outs and like, counter examples to what I'm saying. But for myself, not really. I don't necessarily believe in any kind of supernatural beings in a certain way, not in a way that I really know. On the days that I say that I do, they would have an equal kind of problem of like how you define it. In Zen, it's really like the ideas themselves are just kind of things we put on reality, and recognizing that they're like the lenses we're trying to view reality through is part of the practice. Because you could say, oh, this lens is helpful for me, or it's not helpful for me, or whatever. But like, how do I understand the ideas and the kind of things that I'm trying to put on reality? So I think when I think about supernatural beings, it's also this kind of thing like, oh, well, what am I trying to do to reality when I say that I believe in a supernatural being? Yeah, hopefully I've hedged my bets enough on that one.
I think so. That's interesting. So, in a way, you view that view as a lens.
Yeah, but I mean, like, so our thoughts about what reality is. So if I think there's a God, then I'm making a lot of assumptions about reality itself. Like I'm putting this lens onto reality that has like all these other components to it as well. I mean, especially when you're talking about something as like numinous as like a supernatural being, in which like, but even like concrete things that I have, I'm putting my ideas upon. The easiest example is my own life. I have a very strong narrative about who Duncan is and the things that made Duncan Duncan, but that's just my narrative about it. But like we're kind of made up of these narratives. Our kind of own view of ourselves is a particular kind of lens that we're very attached to. It's not going anywhere, but it's also like built of all these different things kind of globbed together, right? So I tend to think the supernatural is not much different, really. It contains all these things, these ideas that they're helpful, like we need them, but also I think they can be painful if we get trapped by them. One of the biggest things that I've been thinking about recently is my role as chaplain. It's a very like seductive role in the sense that like it feels very important. And there's a lot of people that base their identity on it, like on the work they do. But like I could wake up tomorrow and Vanderbilt could be like, you're out the door. And then like, who am I? What am I? My identity is like fluid. To the extent that I try to fix it in one place, it's painful because it doesn't meet the kind of changing reality of what's happening.
So, are your practices in that way sort of changeable and flexible to what you're seeing and what you're experiencing?
Yeah, I kind of see the practices trying to kind of be some of the tools that I'm using for encountering this changing reality. And how I practice with it has also changed, even if the form itself of sitting down hasn't. I got young kids in my house these days. And so like you try to sit in Zazen, for 20 minutes or something, and like you come the pitter patter of feet and like they burst into the door. And so there's like no place to escape the reality of the children in my house, right? Here they are. And so my expectations, like, no, like I'm supposed to be like sitting in meditation. It's going to be like it's very serious, right? And then here they come to kind of knock me over the head with this other way of being, this other reality. So it's kind of like, yeah, I got to get out of my own way, out of my own idea of what it is to really watch the flexibility of it and the flexibility of life. And sometimes, like everybody, sometimes I'm better at that than other times.
As we all are. What led you to these practices or these beliefs that you hold? In essence, what experience or experiences led you here?
My dad had lung cancer that metastasized to his brain. He was very sick in my high school years. And he passed away here at college. And so I had this kind of experience in which I was very interested in religion.
This is an editing note because the audio drops out in the next few minutes. Duncan is talking about what he learned at college, and he says that the first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is suffering.
And I was taking like an intro class to Buddhism. And the teacher starts the semester by being like, the first noble truth of Buddhism is that life. And I'm like a kid in college and I'm having a great time. And I'm like, well, that's obviously not true, right? My life is great. And then my father died that semester. And I was like, oh, I get it. The grief of that, I think, was the beginning of my practice. And I started practicing because I was in a place where the Dharma came at me with something that felt very true. Like its opening kind of like target statement to me was like, this life is going to also be about loss. At first, I found it particularly grim. I was kind of like, this is not, give me pie in the sky when I die. That's what I want. That's what I'm after. But when I sat with it, when I was with it for a while, I was like, it's honest. It's like starting from a place of like, this is what is going on. What do you want to do with it? And I really found that honesty to be just a wonderful opening door for myself. It spoke to my grief in a way that other things couldn't at that time, because it was ready to acknowledge it. It was ready to say, yes, and it happens to everyone. So now what? So that's how I came to it. I kind of started meditating with a group and reading and taking classes. I kind of came in through the academic way. I still love the philosophy and the stuff around that. It kind of came slowly into the practice. Just kind of finding the contours as I go, just finding where it's been leading.
Yeah. Well, first, I'm sorry for your loss. That sounds like a very terrible thing to go through.
It was terrible. And it's also something that now with distance and time, it's like, I also see like the positive parts. I mean, it was still terrible, but I'm able now to see also the joys of being with my father, even at the end. And also it's such a part of my life now. Like it's defined like so much of like who I am and like how I've chosen to be. I don't know that I have a follow-up statement to that.
That's okay. So you talked about honesty and how these views and the practices seem very honest, the ideas, and how these things you talked before about lenses on reality. So what about these views and ideas seem real to you?
So there's like a great way in which in Buddhism, the teaching is called Dharma. And it means like the teaching, like what Buddha talked about, ostensibly what he said out of his mouth to like people around him. But it also means like reality itself. And the idea is that they're not like two separate things, that like what makes it useful is that it is about reality. So if it doesn't accord with my experiences in a certain way, then I'm like, I don't know what to do with it, right? Like sometimes we can be challenged by something to examine it more, investigate it more. But if it really is not like about reality, then it's not really the Dharma. It's really reality itself. So I don't know. I think the ideas for me, like the ideas such as they are helpful in just opening up myself and trying to examine what this experience of one of my teachers said, what's the experience of the universe Duncaning? Like, here it is, the universe is doing this thing, Duncan, and you get to be a part of it. I think a lot of it points to the ways in which things are constantly changing, the ways in which things are not always in accord with our ideas of what they are, our conceptions of what they are, that reality kind of has this way that it's not limited by our thoughts of what it is. And then it also has this kind of component of the interconnectedness of people and things that I'm not entirely separate from other beings, right? Like I'm informed all the time by the people around me. The food I eat, the energy I take in, it's coming and going through me. That like anywhere, any piece of myself or my process I look at, the more I look, the less I'm able to say, well, this part is Duncan and this part is not Duncan. Because that line is being crossed all the time. There's no part of me that's solid and like roped off from everything else. So, sometimes it's a very like, I was saying about loneliness this morning. Sometimes it's a nice antidote to loneliness. Our experience of loneliness, may not really be ultimate reality. It may not really be true that we are separate beings sitting alone. So I find that comforting. And when I look into it, also seems to be true to some extent.
Yeah, that is a really comforting and lovely idea.
Mm.
It's really helpful, especially when you're in those times of feeling lonely.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a lonely time.
Yes. It seems to be something that's, I've heard a lot of studies and things talking about people, especially in the past couple of years, about how loneliness, especially in feelings of depression and anxiety that go with that, have been just on the rise exponentially.
I mean, I see it firsthand. I think that's one kind of thing. It's like, it's not a study for me. It's like the person I just talked to before I came in to talk with you. It's so real, that feeling of isolation and loneliness and depression and the way at which that kind of stuff chips away at our resilience in a certain way. It's like a cycle that kind of like reinforces itself, especially feelings of isolation, I think. And, this has been a year in which like I've had to interact with a lot of screens. Thankfully, my job never like stopped in a certain way. Like I was not ever sent home. There was an appreciation that something about my work had to be done in person. But even so, my social life moved into a computer screen. I don't know, for me, it's like, hey, this is like a great connective tool. Like we wouldn't be doing this otherwise, even today. But it's also, I think, taught me personally, and I think other people, what's possible, right? Like the kind of ways in which I don't know that this computer screen can fill in for a person's immediate physical presence or the kind of things that we need like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because that's actually part of this project. That's one of the grander ideas of this project, is about the differences in being in person versus being distanced. And then how do we perceive those relationships, and comparing those relationships to how we connect with spirituality and religious beliefs and beings. So
I think there's I guess like maybe I'm like soured on the kind of the electronic world. And it's a good time to talk about how it's failed us. So I'll give you my experience of being in community, the Zen community over Zoom, which has been made very difficult because I don't have a space to do it. My house has no space that is set apart. So to be at home is to be in the chaos of my home with my small children. So like, first, the lack is the physical space, right? So if you go to a Zendo, you've got like kind of a space of quiet and contemplation for the kind of slowing down to be present. There's none of that in my house. So, the first thing I miss is the physical space, right? Like it's not there. We reopened a couple weeks ago and I got to like go in and like just be there and sit on a cushion in this space and like light the incense and do the bows before the altar and like hit the drums and the bells and like all the sensory things that go along with that physical space. I thought it was kind of weird. I thought that I started this kind of pandemic thing like, you know what, this is great. I'm going to like spend some time, get on Zoom with all these different communities I've been a part of previously, like in different parts of the US. Like I was a part of like a song in Boston for a while, New York, I got some people in LA. I want to, like, I'll be sitting with all these people, like we'll have these, like, and I did once. And I was like, I can't do this. And so even though like I kept up with the Nashville folks every week on Zoom, it ultimately just kind of like, I don't know, felt very hollow to me. And I know other people have had different experiences. I'm not trying to say that this is like that Zoom isn't a great connector in real ways. But for me, it didn't hit something that I needed. And maybe that's a strange thing to say about a practice that primarily is done with your backs to everyone else, in silence, like, but it's true for me.
Yeah. You were talking about the incense and the sensory things and the prayer. That was actually one of the questions that I was going to ask you about different objects or tangible things that you have or do in your practice that makes your practice more concrete, makes you able to connect with these ideas that you have in a more concrete way. Are there more things like that?
I mean, it's interesting that you say that. There's like a kind of way in which, from a Zen perspective, I wouldn't let that go unexamined, what it means to connect with an idea. One of the big things in the Zendo is you might have like an altar in which there's a place for incense, there's like some flowers, there's some kind of like image of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva seated there. And one of the big things when people come in, like for the first couple of times, is we do a lot of bowing toward the altar. There's kind of like standing bowing, which like you're putting like the palms of your hands together, bending over your waist. It's one kind of bow. But we also do like full prostrations in which you kind of like drop to your knees, like face down on the ground, and like, your whole body kind of laid out. People see that and they're like, again, in the South, this kind of idea that there's this idol worship going on or something. And that's, I don't think that's really the case in Zen. This idea is that like the Buddha is this kind of teacher and there's this reverence that you have for the teacher, but the Buddha is not going to come save you. Like don't hold out. But I think the flip side of that too is that like those are also just my ideas of what it is, right? And so the invitation is that whenever anyone comes in to the center and does like a bowing practice toward the Buddha, what does that represent? At various times to me, it's represented some kind of physical, historical teacher. Sometimes it represents to me wisdom itself, or like everyone, including my ability to like see reality and have wisdom to like guide me. And sometimes it's just a bit of wood that someone carved, and kind of asking myself the question every time I do it. So in Zen, it's not so much that you're connecting to the idea, but that you watch that connection. You say, hey, what is this idea? What is this connection? How is it? What is happening? as all these things are going on. What does it mean to bow to your innate wisdom? But I do love the sensory things too. And there's like a tension in it, right? A kind of tension of being like, oh, Zen's not about ideas, but here's this like, statue of this guy on this altar, and you better, that's what we do every week is bow to it. You don't have to, there's no forcing in Zen, but there is this kind of tension. I don't know. I'm trying not to make it too muddled, but I feel like I'm doing a poor job. The concrete's it's just helpful, but it's not necessary. That's part of it's part of the thing that's built up. But there's nothing about the practice that requires a zendo or incense or anything in particular of you just showing up for your life.
Yeah. Do you think that are those things, the prayer and the bowing and having statues and incense and flowers, are those things that you are introduced to when you are introduced to Zen Buddhism, and then as you build your practice, you can go away from them? Or is it just something that sort of you always are connected to? If those things are a stronger presence in your practice at the very beginning and then sort of drop off as you practice more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A few things. I would be careful of the word prayer. I don't think many people in Zen would use that word for what they're doing. So yeah, the first time I walked into a Zen center, I got sat down and someone was like, okay, this is the setup. We're going to ring this bell. You bow. Okay. And then you're going to like go and sit. You're going to sit for 20 minutes. And they're very specific on the form. This leg's going to be on this leg. It's going to be like this. And your back's going to be straight. And your head's going to be like at this angle. And your eyes are going to be like, there's this whole like intense thing. And okay, then there's going to be another bell. And you're going to stand up. And you're going to hold your arms like this. And your hands like this. And you're going to, and they're showing you all these things that happen. And there's not a lot of discussion of why. There's, in fact, very little discussion. Like the beginning is a lot of discussion of like, this is just what we do. And then you get to be like, why? Why are we bound? Why are we sitting like this? Why are we? And so kind of like questioning why we're doing all these things becomes like part of like the experience. I think it was for me. Like, I was like, oh, what is this? What is this? What's this? And I kind of came to it like many people come to it after reading some books or having some practices. So I was like cobbling together my own answers for why all these things. And then, trying to cobble together what I was being told in the Zen Center and Dharma talks and things. And in the end, like recognizing that these are just my attempts to understand why. The forms of the practice, the image of the Buddha, all these things are, there maybe aren't definitive answers. There's an answer within the tradition. There's a historical answer. You can trace the development, for example, of the Buddha statue. The very beginning, there wasn't anything. There were no images of the Buddha in the earliest stuff. He was displayed by like an absence or like a symbol, like I don't know how to describe it. It's like kind of like the wheel on like a ship. You imagine like turning. It has like 8 spokes. It represents like the eightfold path. So like that would be in the place of where the Buddha was supposed to be. But then over time, like there was the development of this Buddhist iconography, and you can like trace how it changes, and like the addition of like bodhisattvas into like the idea. Like you can do that historical thing, and you kind of reach this idea of, okay, this is why it's done, but it doesn't actually capture it for you, which is really the important part. I find it a kind of fascinating academic question as to why a 16th century Japanese person bowed to this image of the Buddha, but like it doesn't necessarily inform why I do, right? That's kind of the trick to it all, right? You got to form your own answers. So I think people are kind of like you were saying, they kind of have this encounter with the forms, and then maybe some of them fall off, maybe some of them don't. I think there's like seasons, there's seasons. I've been more about the incense and the drums and the chanting and all of the forms, and then other seasons where I'm like, doesn't matter, like that's fine. That's fine. It'll keep changing, I'm sure.
Is there something that brings you back to those seasons of you said it doesn't matter, but then you maybe come back to it. Is there something or some instance that brings you back to those things?
I mean, sometimes there's kind of like a thing, you get to a place where you're like, this is all nonsense, like, what am I, this is not a way to spend a Saturday morning. Like, there's nothing in this, right? And then other times feeling there's something very profound that's being pointed to. That, to borrow one of the images that's used a lot, this metaphor of like fingers pointing at the moon, that like all this stuff that's happening is the finger like pointing at the moon. And so if you kind of take the finger as the thing, you've missed the moon, you've missed the point, right? But it doesn't also make the fingers unimportant, right? And I think, this season in particular, I've been eager to get back to some of the forms, some of like the sensory things that I was talking about, because I don't know, it kind of gets my body in the place of practice itself. It kind of aligns it to the kind of sense of like, okay, this is what I'm doing right now. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. Is it grounding in a way?
That's a good word for it. It is grounding.
So, what does it mean for you to care for someone's spiritual health as a chaplain?
Yeah. Spiritual is a great word because it's strategically vague.
Yep, that's what we're going for.
I'm in a weird business. That's how I feel. Because I'm kind of making this claim that I'm doing something different than like the pastor on Sunday morning or the Zen monk giving a Dharma talk. That like I'm doing something that may be adjacent and maybe like similar, but is somehow also different. I think the claim is one that like everybody has a kind of spiritual sense, and people have really different definitions of the word. For me, like I'm interested in what's meaningful to people. Like how do they imagine their life and meaning within their life? When they think of the good life, what is it? It can tell us a lot about a person. Then there's like the connective tissue of it, right? Like the community of it. And it doesn't particularly matter to me, like in my care as a chaplain, whether a person is like attending like some kind of religious service in which they're like engaged with a community there, or whether they're part of like a skateboarding group and they're just like with these like dozen individuals any given weekend. What's important is the human connection of it, right? Like that is like spiritual in a sense. There's also something spiritual about our understanding of ourselves. And working in mental health, there's a lot of focus on how we kind of degrade ourselves. That kind of the voices in us, whether actual or imagined, that put us down, that kind of way that we're harder on ourselves than anyone else. That kind of criticalness that we have toward ourselves. And I shouldn't speak for everyone because I don't know that. I suspect something about this is universal, but I haven't checked with everyone to know. But it can be very hard to love ourselves. And so I think that ultimately becomes a real target of the kind of spiritual care that I'm giving. And that to me is like also a message to myself. Like I often tell my patients, if I'm trying to give a message to myself, it's like, I am enough. Whatever it is, I am enough. I don't have to be someone else or something else or better than I am right now, right? I'm not loved and accepted and worthwhile because of what I'm going to do later or what I did in the past, but just right now, whatever it is. I think that's kind of an invitation back to just this moment. It's tricky to define what I do, but I think that's a lot of it. And so I'm interested in drawing out from people what their answers to these things are, how they experience it, how they experience being in the hospital. What does that do to their sense of self, to their sense of family or God or whatever it is? And it's a lot more listening than talking. So this is like a weird thing for me. Like I'm here like trying to like explain these things, but it's the opposite of what I do in my work, because there's nothing to explain. It's about listening.
So, how does your practice, your Zen practice, affect how you approach other people and your relationships with them? So, people at the hospital or your friends, your family, how does your practice affect those relationships?
I think it is in some ways about trying to be present to the person in front of me. I think the practice helps me to listen well because it's about being present to another person. And this same kind of practice of sitting in zazen and being present to whatever's arising is the same kind of practice of being present to whoever's in front of you. And it's a kind of practice of trying not to be distracted, right? Not to be lost in your own thoughts, not to be daydreaming, and to really be kind of open up some curiosity toward another person. So, I see my Zen practice as helping me to do that, as like helping me to be more open to other people, more emotionally available. And in my personal life too, I think a lot of it has been about Zen helping me to be more aware of what's going on with me. I mean, that's a little paradoxical to what I just said, but like more emotionally aware of what's happening, like a greater emotional intelligence. That's maybe the word for it. To be aware of the ways in which what's happening inside of me is manifesting. That's another big skill that I think it's like helped me with, adjacent with other things that like have helped me to do more of that. So it's not that I attribute it entirely to my Zen practice, but it's a piece of it. It's a piece of just understanding myself.
Yeah. Do you have any other thoughts on these topics in general that you'd like to contribute?
No, I mean, I think it's an interesting topic. And, is topical because of like what's happening right now and the kind of changing nature of our religious focus and our personal focus. One thing I tend to like about Buddhism is it challenges a lot of assumptions about what religion is, and invites us into a kind of holistic relationship with practice in our life, in which like it's not necessarily compartmentalized in different ways, right? Like this is my life. I this is what I've got. What do I want to do with it? And that kind of, I don't know, just direct invitation. So it spills all over the place. And so, this 2 years, year and a half, 2 years is like profoundly affected myself and my practice, because it's just been such a disruption. And I don't know, thinking about how to make the best of it, to reclaim what's helpful, to try to understand the limitations of what distance communication is really important. I hope we all have more opportunities at the end of this thing to be together in person. But I also recognize that like part of our modern life is going to be like this. And I'm interested in understanding more of what the promise of that is, and also what I'm not going to get out of it. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the conversation and just the time. You got an interesting project. I hope it goes well. I hope you piece together something that's meaningful, or at least interesting for people.
Thank you. I hope so too. And thank you for your time. It's been a really good conversation.
Well, you're very welcome. Take care. If you need anything else, let me know. Always happy to help with it.